Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. My name is Ariel Cohen. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a managing director of Energy, Growth, and Security Program at the International Tax and Investment Center in Washington, D.C. I'm also the founder and president of International Market Analysis, a boutique consulting firm. We are going to talk about one of the most transformative trends in the modern economy and beyond the economy in the modern society, the green transformation. It was called a megatrend. It's a defining transition of our times, just as historically changed the geopolitical balances in the world, the employment, the environmental standards, and the reason we have so many people here is because you understand, just as we do, how important that is. We have a terrific panel today. We will start with Joshua Lincoln, a senior fellow from my alma mater, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, followed by Mahmoud Galal from Egypt, the CEO of Bioenergy. Then Mr. Tim Yeo, chairman of Nuclear Watch Institute, talking about nuclear as a low-emission energy. And Monsieur Jean Santenac, if I pronounce it correctly, the CEO of the Axens Group. I am asking my panelists to speak in the area of their expertise for about 5 minutes. Then we will open for Q&A between myself and the panelists, and then you're of course welcome to comment on fellow panelists' presentations, and then hopefully we'll have enough time to have audience participation. Thank you very much. And now to Dr. Lincoln to set the scene for this discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the social scientist here, so my job is to set the scene. These other gentlemen will bring you the solutions, practically speaking. But I want to start where Ariel left off. We are in the midst of a great pivot. The image that I sometimes use when I'm talking to my son or other people is a big ship. The big ship was going towards rocks called unsustainable climate disaster, and eventually the ship turned. And we have now, somewhere between 2015, the Paris Agreement, 2021 would be the other side, the ship turned. But of course it's not one ship. If you're counting countries, it's about 200 ships. If you're counting businesses, if you're counting cities, it's tens of thousands. And this is commonly known, thought of as we are saving ourselves by moving away from the oil economy. So it's an act of common self-preservation. But in the process, it's also an act of competition. And as all of these ships are trying to turn to reorient their economies, their societies away from oil and towards low carbon development, there are elements of competition, there are elements of difficulty. So from that standpoint, as we come out of the turn and we look ahead of ourselves, down the new direction that we're going on, what do we see? And what are the salient features that we can, Ariella alluded to them, that we can identify in the period ahead? I would suggest to you that there are three things that we see that we need to think about, and that then pose the imperative for the kinds of solutions, the kind of practical applications that my fellow panelists are going to talk about. The first is vulnerability. There is a large number of states today that are already vulnerable. They're socially vulnerable. They're in a state of vulnerability from a developmental standpoint. And the pivot away from oil is going to increase that vulnerability. There's a Carbon Tracker Initiative study that finds that over the next 20 years, cumulatively, globally, governments are going to have to do with $13 trillion less of revenues. This is a fiscal gap that is going to emerge The brunt of that $13 billion is going to be felt in 22 countries. In those countries, what we know from the experience is those fiscal dollars translate into social services. When governments can no longer provide social services, that tends to lead to social instability. It will reinforce divisions inside countries, and it will also accelerate the differences between countries. So this process of fiscal vulnerability is compounded by what we might call a capacity vulnerability, which is set aside the idea of a government taking in revenue from oil and gas and being able to spend it on social programs. Not all countries have an equal ability to, from a financial standpoint and from a human resources standpoint and from a system standpoint, to weather the kind of transformation, deep transformation in economic terms that is called upon. That's why you will hear so much talk about climate financing, for example. That capacity, again, McKinsey is one of several private organizations that have done a study in 2022 in which they tried to assess a vulnerability, a transition exposure score to different countries, which is on a scale of 1 to 100, how well equipped is a country to go through the deep change that they need to do. How are their capital markets structured? How are their human resources structured? What are their systems in place? What can they draw on as they go through this very strenuous exercise of changing, as Arya said, for the first time really since the beginning of the oil revolution, so since the 1850s, to go through a transition of this scope. And they found that there's a very wide variety of variation in how countries can do that. The second trend is competition. As we come out of this, as you all know, perhaps an electric car requires 6 times the amount of minerals that a regular car does today. So we are going to, in effect, substitute one problem or one challenge for another. IEA estimates a 400 to 600% increase over the next 30 to 40 years in mineral extraction. Now, we know that Kazakhstan is blessed with mineral resources, so in some respects that's a good story. But we also know that extractive resources are challenging across the board. So what we see developing is this extraordinary emerging competition over the mineral resources that are the keys to unlocking the next stage of development to develop low carbon technologies. It's an interesting way to understand the relationship between the major economies, North America, Europe, China, and to try and assess where we are headed in that direction. A series of these competitions are emerging. The third and last thing that I would say is simply this. When you take those two trends together, that is increased vulnerability for some states and increased competition in new areas, you begin to draw an idea of how difficult the next period is going to be. How intensely intensely vulnerable a set of states are going to become. And this brings us back to the question that I would leave you with, the final question. I'm sorry to be brief on it. When we talk about climate finance and we talk about technology transfers, these are the two big concepts that have been kicked around ever since the Paris Agreement. They're really based on what I would call an old aid and development model. Given the scale of the challenges that we're talking about, I think it's not possible to remain with those models. We have to find ways. Climate finance has not worked as a model so far, and even if it were to work to 100% of what it's been promised, it would not deliver what is required. The last thing on that is that technology transfer concepts are going to have to evolve. They currently take the form of north to south. We will hand you a technology that we have developed when we're finished using it or on certain terms, and we need to move towards co-development and co-ownership of technology transfers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I was listening to Dr. Lincoln's presentation, I was thinking back to all these columns I wrote for Forbes. I'm an energy columnist for Forbes over a number of years. And two things stand out that are relevant to the topic at hand, to the topic today, in terms of this transition. In order to take alternative sources of energy, solar, wind, and such, and pour it into the grids, two things need to happen, without which the majority of experts are convinced this transition will be sputtering. One is storage, because when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, we cannot direct this energy from the generation capacity into the grid. And second, because of intermittency of supply, we need to have a much smarter grid than we have today. The grids we have, including in the United States and elsewhere, some of them are 100 years old. You know, they may have replaced some wires or some transformers, but essentially it's a dumb grid. It doesn't have the capacity to move electricity quickly from one source to another. So the smart grid and storage will push this transformation much, much further ahead. And with that, we are now going to Mr. Galal. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Errol. So my name is Mahmoud Galal. I am a CEO of Bioenergy. Bioenergy, I started this company almost 13 years ago when I was studied in the US. I'm a graduate from University of San Diego. I'm truly entrepreneur. My company works on waste to energy and producing alternative fuels. We work in Egypt and another 9 countries. We start from Egypt, but we work in Egypt, Morocco, Italy, UK, and most of Middle East countries. We solve the problem of the fossil fuels. We replace the coal, which is used in high-intensive industries like the cement and steel industry, with green energy comes from waste, municipal solid waste, agriculture waste, sludge waste, any kind can be an energy and replace. This is happened 100 years ago. If you go back 100 years ago, before the oil, we use the wood for energy. We use the agriculture waste in our homes. Back to my country, what 100 years ago. So we also work in the recycling business, recycling the plastics into food-grade products. We have 2 plants in Italy for recycling of plastics, and one plant for recycling the glass. We focus on the renewable resources. Waste is everywhere, but also the CO2 emissions we cannot imagine. The climate change now, which is the problem we faced, is not a luxury. Now in Asatana, we face a summer. It's not the summer yet, because the summer officially will enter 21 of June. And now in the spring, we face a 40 Celsius degree in the spring. It's a serious. The 60% of the CO2 emissions came from 2 industries, the cement and the steel industry. So we try to solve and work with these big multinational companies. And 3 years ago in Glasgow, COP26, we start an initiative supported by the President Biden and John Kerry, supported the first mover coalition, which is try to get the emissions of the steel and cement reduced by 30% by 23. A country like Kazakhstan, which is full of coal and full of oil and gas, but also they have a resource. The waste comes from anything. We can use the man waste and our waste, the manure waste, for energy. We can recycling everything. This happened, but because of the modernize and what happened in the last 10 years, we stopped to recycle, we stopped to think about the resources we have. So we used to have the world with oil and gas and coal, but we can imagine the world without waste. So we here to solve this kind of problem. Thank you, Errol.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for being on time. I was not going to ask follow-up questions, but one quick question. If you were to estimate in your sector of waste, what is the value in US dollars of all the resources that are not yet used? What would you say?
I think it's a huge. It's more than $100 billion. If you imagine the
worldwide.
Yeah.
Right.
If you speak about the plastics, which came from in all our applications in all our life, came from oil industry. So just currently, only Europe have a mandatory 30% recycled content by 2025. So emerging markets, no. Still US under discussion. Africa, no. Asia, no. So you are speaking about huge resources goes to landfill. And imagine the cost of landfill. The 1 ton of waste costs $400 if it goes to landfill.
So you're basically saying we're taking money and just burying it in the ground.
Yeah.
Let's move on. If you think about the available low emission or zero emission generation capacity that is steady, predictable, reliable, right? The base load. What comes to mind? Nuclear. And we have an outstanding expert to talk about it, Mr. Tim Yeo. Please.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And I'm delighted to have the chance to talk about what I think is the most important issue in the energy world right now, and that is how to achieve this green energy transition, or the transformation, as Ariel called it earlier on. The aims of energy policy have always been security of supply and affordability, but in recent years a third one has risen up the agenda, and I think it's now at the top. That is how to prevent dangerous and irreversible climate change, which we are not very far away from right now. We've had some painful reminders in the last couple of years. One was that no nation is secure when it depends too heavily on imported gas or oil, even if those imports come from previously reliable humans, unless we step up the pace at which we're making the clean energy transition. Here in Kazakhstan, the huge fossil fuel reserves have been a great source of strength, but I fear they may also make it slightly more difficult than in some countries to make the green energy transition. And even though that, of course, is essential to achieve the necessary cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, and can also by itself improve energy security and deliver more price stability. Demand for electricity is also going to go on rising. It's increasingly used for heating and for cooling. The electric vehicle revolution is speeding up despite the consequences for certain minerals. And electricity, of course, is being more and more used to power the rapidly expanding data processing technologies, which are very electricity intensive. So to achieve this transition, carbon capture and storage could be part of the process, but at present, frankly, it's too expensive, and we can't guarantee it's going to get cheaper anytime soon. Obviously, renewables are a huge part of the solution, and even though I'm here really as a nuclear spokesman, I fully support the rapid and continuing growth of renewables. Nuclear and renewables are complementary. It's not an either-or. The world needs both. Kazakhstan is well placed, actually, to expand in both nuclear and in renewables, and it starts with the advantage of being one of the biggest uranium suppliers in the world. We've seen in the Emirates in the last few years how you can build 4 nuclear plants on time and more or less on budget. That was an impressive example, and I think it's capable of being reproduced here. They also managed to train a locally recruited workforce with the necessary skills. So the tide is turning in favour of nuclear. Even the European Commission, traditionally very hostile to nuclear, has finally admitted that nuclear poses no risk to human health or to the environment. And soon we'll have the small advanced modular reactors, which may help to cut costs considerably. Of course, the elephant in the room at the moment is the geopolitics and the sanctions that are being applied, obviously, to Russia. When it comes to nuclear, sanctions may not always be helpful. In fact, they may actually slow down the global energy transition. They may make it harder to tackle climate change. There was a time in the last century when there was a Westinghouse and Siemens never stopped working with the Russians. They were working on constructing a plant in Finland. France went on importing much of its enriched uranium from Russia, and that was for a good reason. The economics of nuclear require as much long-term stability and interdependence as possible. So, within this equation, cooperation in launching an international nuclear energy project can be a win-win. By contrast, pausing or cancelling cooperation can produce a lose-lose. 10 years ago, when I chaired the UK Parliament Energy and Climate Change Committee, the UK government was planning to add tens of gigawatts of new nuclear capacity. People were queuing up to bid for the work. The Chinese were invited in to participate. Even the Russians were on the list of possible vendors, despite a rather uneasy foreign policy context. But today, the geopolitical winds are blowing in the opposite direction. Britain sent the Chinese away, having approved their technology for use in the UK. Deployment of Russian technology is completely unthinkable in the present circumstances. But who loses from all this? Neither, it seems, the Chinese vendors, nor indeed Rosatom, both of whom have got thriving international businesses. But the consequence for the UK is that we're now struggling to achieve our nuclear expansion ambitions. Without China's investment, without Russian technology, fewer nuclear plants will be built around the world, and those that are will be at a higher cost. Most of the innovative, advanced new generation reactors being developed in the US still use low enriched uranium produced in Russia. Cutting off the supply of Russian uranium will slow down the development of advanced reactors. Of course, it's tricky to sanction Rosatom without shooting ourselves in the foot as a result of all this. I personally think that if we're really serious about climate change and using nuclear to address that challenge, we need to consider cooperation, similar to what's happened in the past. Why shouldn't multinational consortia bring in leading vendors from different countries to join forces in taking on the challenge of accelerating nuclear new build? The project I mentioned in Finland is a good example. It was based on the Russian nuclear island. Its design was enhanced and augmented by Western equipment, turbines, and similarly here in Kazakhstan. It could be a Russian, Korean, French, Japanese partnership, a sort of overriding grand alliance. Kazakhstan has an opportunity to lead the green energy transition in Central Asia. And this could create new jobs for its citizens, a cleaner environment, a growing economy, but particularly if it chose to structure a long-term deal based on international cooperation, it might set an example which the rest of the world could follow and maybe even usher in a new era of peaceful cooperation.
Well, I have things to say about that, looking from Washington, but I'm not going to do it now. We'll go to Q&A a bit later. Et maintenant, monsieur, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Ariel. I'm also a great fan of nuclear.
Is your mic on?
This way?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I have a few slides if you can put them. I was saying I'm also a great fan of nuclear. Being French is not a surprise, but I think without nuclear we will not reach the net zero at that time. So I want to talk another opportunity for Kazakhstan, which is the production of sustainable aviation fuel. Today, airlines, companies are all seeking for these fuels because it is known as to be the only solution to decarbonize the aviation and avoid the no-fly attitude of certain youngsters and progress to decarbonize this industry. When you talk to airline company, they don't believe in hydrogen for long distance, maybe short distance. They don't believe on solar flight. They believe in low carbon fuels, sustainable fuels to decarbonize our industry. So if I can have my few slides. Accents, the company I'm heading, is a technology project development company. We have developed in the world around 3,000 license or projects in the field of fuels production, bio or fossil, chemicals, gas treatment. We have a large activity in Kazakhstan. We know very well the country. Have been involved in many projects in the refineries, in the gas treatment, in the petrochemical. Just last week we signed an agreement with KMG for biopolymer for polyethylene near Tirao. And I want to talk for another opportunity for Kazakhstan, which is the SAF production. SAF stands for Sustainable Aviation Fuels. There are many routes, and a lot of people are working to develop these sustainable aviation fuels. You can process, and I'm coming to Mahmoud, waste like used cooking oil and make these kind of fuels. You can also process wood waste, gasify them, and then polymerize them to make this kind of fuel. You can add hydrogen coming from nuclear, and you increase even the yields. This is called e-biofuels. And you can also start from ethanol, which is what in the US they are doing a lot. In Japan also. This is an example of projects we are developing with a US company called Gevo. They are starting from ethanol, which is not competing with food because they split the ethanol, the corn grain between the proteins, which is going to animal feed, and the rest, carbohydrates or the waste that we can process to make ethanol, and then jet fuels. Also project in Japan, in India are pursued, and I believe it's a great opportunity to Kazakhstan because in the north of Kazakhstan, you have already ethanol production from wheat that can be easily expanded. Of course, this requires investment. And this requires also the concurrence of regulation, the Kazakh producing companies, but I believe we can be there. Of course, and I come to I prevent the aerial question. These fuels are more expensive by 3 to 4 times the fossil fuel. It's about €3 per liter compared to 1 in average. But now the airlines are paying this price. Of course, this will be put in the ticket at the end of the day. But this is the solution, which is, I believe, an opportunity for Kazakhstan to become a big player in this with several 100,000 tons, and either use them for their own flights or export to Europe, which has a mandate by 2035 to have 20% of these fuels from 2% today in the plane. So there is a big market which is going to be opened. A new industry is under creation. It's not an easy one. Many things will come into play, but I think it's an opportunity also, that was my message today, to create jobs in the country, develop farmers' revenues, and participate to the decarbonization effort of the world, because large surface possibility to have crops without too much water input, and in the north of the country at least, and participate to that effort. Thank you. I think I stay in my 5 minutes, I hope.
Parfait. Merci beaucoup, monsieur. Thank you very much. I think kudos to the panel for sticking to the time limit. I would do a very quick Q&A, and you're welcome to comment on each other's presentations as well. My first question is to Mr. Tim Yao. While we all aware that nuclear is a mature technology, it's been around for what, 60 years as civilian nuclear power, why is it that, for example, in the United States we have one nuclear reactor under construction in Georgia? I recently wrote about it in my Forbes column. You're welcome to look it up. And that reactor, if I remember correctly, is 7 years and $17 billion in time and cost overrun. If I remember correctly, the example in Finland is 5+ billion and several years overrun. Something is wrong, and other reactors in France, etc. Something is wrong when you have consistent phenomenon in the West. I'm not talking about Rosatom, it's a whole different calculus, or Chinese reactors. But if you look at US, Toshiba, Westinghouse, Areva, etc., what's going on in the industry, and where are the guarantees once we jump a generation to small modular reactors? It's not going to be the same. Please explain to us, and if anything can be done, Kazakhstan is considering a reactor, a civilian reactor for itself. Something is wrong with this picture, and what can be done to address that?
Yes, I'm afraid the history has been a pretty sorry one in many countries of developing new nuclear reactors. I think at the heart of this is the reluctance of any country to go nap and say, don't let's build 1 or 2, let's build 6 or 8 or 10. We just don't want, a gigawatt or 2, we want 10 or 15 gigawatts. I mean, the nearest example recently was the UAE, when they commissioned 4 from the South Koreans, which were built, 4 identical units. And if countries, and this applies to the UK, who've got ambitious programs, but if they said, I've been arguing, go out to tender, so we want a tender for 6 new 1.5 gigawatt reactors, then you get a much better price. We're already discovering that EDF, which are developing one in the West Country in the UK, and they've started the second one on the same site, they're saying they'll get at least a 25 to 30% reduction in the cost by building 2 identical ones side by side. So I think the commissioning process has been seriously at fault. I think with the new smaller ones, there is a hope that there'll be some significant cost savings. Because they're smaller, they're going to be modular, they can be manufactured mostly in factories, which makes it much easier to meet the safety standards that are required. One of the reasons why building a big new plant is the safety requirements, quite rightly, have got tighter and tighter, and therefore you're constantly having to revise the thing as you go along. If you can build it in a factory and then ship it to where it's going to be, that should cut some of the costs. And again, there will be real competition. There are probably half a dozen countries now hoping to get into the market for small modular reactors, a couple in North America, obviously some in Asia, and some in Europe as well. So I think there's a hopeful signs, but there have been serious failures of commissioning, and I think perhaps some over-prescriptive national regulators who don't always collaborate as well as, or in the past, haven't always collaborated with other countries as well as they could.
Excellent. A follow-up question, if I may, is about the security of small modular reactors, and that is a lot of countries we're talking about do not have nuclear reactors. They'll have these almost a container size, or maybe a couple of container size, very complicated machinery sent to them. It's supposed to be either sealed or require minimal maintenance, but at the same time, the fuel is 20% enriched. If breached and accessed, God forbid, can be used in a dirty bomb. Do you have concerns about the safety and security and the level of technical personnel that will be required in a place like, I don't know, Tanzania to operate such a reactor?
I think the risk of sort of contamination across to nuclear weapons is pretty tightly controlled by the International Atomic Energy Authority. I think they have been on top of that situation for quite a long time now. And I think it's unlikely that any regime which was thought to be unable to be policed by them would be supplied by any reputable supplier. And the suppliers of small modular reactors are going to stay want to stay being reputable because they want to have a wide international market. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. I think that clearly close collaboration between regulators, and particularly where a nuclear plant, even a small one, is going to a country which has never had a nuclear plant before, there will need to be collaboration and perhaps some sort of international inspection panel in the early years to make sure that the regulation in those new countries is as tight as it needs to be. But I think the nuclear is so tightly scrutinized and has been for the last, I suppose, 40 years, that the risks, although I understand that they do exist in theory, I think in practice it's much lower risk than people might assume.
Would other panelists want to add anything either to their presentations or to each other presentations before we go to the audience? And I'm just wondering if there are roving mic here, or I'm getting some questions here on through the app, but I have only one question there.
Yeah, maybe Ariel, if you allow me one comment, building on what you say and Tim just say on nuclear industry, at least for our country in France. One of the problems we suffered is the loss of expertise, because 15 years ago, our government was saying, the German went out of nuclear, and our government say, we will ramp down nuclear. Now we say the contrary, but when you say to a company like EDF, you will go out or gradually go out from the business, they don't hire people, they don't train, they train less people, and we lost expertise. I mean, to answer your question about a project overrun I think it's a long-term industry, and our societies need to make decisions and stay for these decisions for the long run and train people. Now to rebuild our industry, they say they would need to hire every year 10% of the graduated engineers coming for our schools for 10 years to build up again the expertise. So this is I think this is part of one explanation, and I don't know in the US what happened, but if it's happened similarly, but we had that ups and downs in the decision making.
I have things to say about it, but I want the colleagues to contribute specifically about technical expertise, the need thereof, the need of technical education, and what do you see from Fletcher, from Egypt, from UK? It is a big problem, not just in nuclear. I have friends in oil equipment processing industry. They cannot find welders, they cannot find technicians. And everybody in the US wants to be a lawyer or a business development guy. So or gal, what can you say about that? The STEM education for the real world, what's going on?
Okay, I have a comment related to the expensive of the reactors, and something any green transition, it's expensive because you already work in the right way. It's not matter of the cost anymore because it's matter of our life. And coal is cheap and oil is cheap, but comparable to renewable energy, we need this renewable energy for the next century because we face a huge problem. And regarding the education, yes, everyone wants to be entrepreneurs because it's part of...
Everybody wants to be an influencer.
Yeah, because it's matter of easy money. We don't find the technicians. Yes, it's everywhere in the world.
Are there places that you can't really find the technicians, or places like that don't exist?
It's hard. It's hard. I think it's too many challenges that's faced the companies when you have an idea, then either you transfer to startup and startup to small company, you have too many challenges. One of them is sustainability. The sustainability not from environmental perspective, sustainability of the team, the cash flow, the business model, the right people, started from the small technicians till the CEO. And other one is the growth, how to grow, how to take this company to the next level. And I think this is the main challenge we faced, how to take the green energy to the next level.
Just to add to that, in listening to the conversation about nuclear, I was thinking, in a way, this is where I left off in my remarks, which is, I almost had the words global industrial policy on my lips, but not quite. We're still making sandwiches when we need to be cooking in a serious way. The transition to thinking about how to do things at scale, given the scale of the needs and given the difficulties ahead of us, we have to keep expanding the exponential nature of our own thinking. And this comes up in the training. I was talking to somebody in the United States in the aftermath of the IRA. One of their biggest problems is retraining, because they just haven't given enough thought to the retraining process. Everybody likes to say that an oil worker has fundamentally the same skills as a wind farm worker, meaning if you work on an oil rig offshore, yes, exactly, then you should naturally be able to work on a wind farm offshore as well. If you've ever tried to convince, I'll use a US example, a Texas oil worker who rigs on a rig in the sort of Bay of Mexico,
The Permian, yeah, whatever.
to move to Maine to begin to work on
Windmills.
on windmills, no way. And never mind the educational system that can take such a person, put them through probably a year or 2 years of training, assuming that they're ready, and move them into place for the next thing. That's a small example. You heard the 10-year example with respect to sort of qualified personnel on the nuclear side. So I see this problem over and over again. We're not thinking big enough with respect. We're doing interesting thinking. The world of entrepreneurship, thank God we have it. The world of startups is incredibly important. But right now, the challenge is in scaling these things and in ensuring their sustainability at scale.
Well, it's funny, where I come from the United States, if you look at the campuses, if you listen to what people in the academic community in the campuses are saying, they say, we need green energy, we need transition. Oil is bad, hydrocarbons are horrible, but we're also anti-capitalist. Capitalism is bad, entrepreneurship is bad, working for a corporate is horrible. Who the bleep is going to enact this green transition? Your grandma? No. It's going to be the private sector. These are going to be the companies. These are going to be men and women who are trained in STEM and in specific technical skills. If it's argon welding, is it space, satellite engineering? Is it laser technology? These are not going to be people like me and Mr. Lincoln, the political scientists and the lawyers. Sorry, guys. So we have, what, about 15 minutes left, the organizers? When does this end? 13 minutes. At 5? 30 minutes, perfect. Anything else from the panelists before? Yes.
Just to add the idea, I was rereading a report by the International Energy Agency where they were basically calling for a new concept of energy security. And since this panel's about energy, they're saying the new concept of energy security really has to be one that emphasizes the timing of the growth of renewables and the off-ramping of oil, and that the modeling of this needs to be the definition of energy security. It will not help anyone for these two processes to be uncoordinated. In fact, one has to be slightly ahead of the other. You cannot bring old sources of energy offline until you have new sources of energy coming online. That's not a popular thing to say, but we are beginning to accumulate examples of what happens when you don't pay attention to that idea. And I thought it's interesting for us to rethink energy security. We think of energy security as diversification right now. That's good, but energy security also needs to be about timing.
And an example I'm thinking about when you're talking about that is that Germany decided to phase out 6 nuclear reactors at the same time they were forced to give up the Gazprom gas. And that, ladies and gentlemen, doubled and tripled the cost of kilowatt in Germany. It put the German industry in a disadvantageous position at the same time as they were losing the Russian market. And whoever was conceiving this energy policy, I have some questions to them, especially over decades after the Americans were talking to the Germans till we're blue in the face about an excessively high dependence on Russian gas, foreseeing that Russia may use the dependence on their natural gas as a political tool, as they did since 2006, right, in different countries. So this is an example of ill thought through energy policy, exactly what Mr. Lincoln is talking about. Yes, sir.
And one other consequence of that crass German decision to close down all their nuclear power stations was a huge increase in the consumption of lignite coal, a particularly polluting form of coal.
Please explain what lignite coal does.
Well, it certainly pollutes the air quality. So millions, or certainly hundreds of thousands of Germans will have died somewhat prematurely as a direct result of that decision.
It's what, twice as polluting as regular anthracite or regular black coal? Yeah. Okay, let's start picking some questions from the audience. Shingiz Sadiq is saying, good afternoon. How come we build nuclear submarines? This is Mr. Yer here. We're building nuclear submarines which have small reactors, but we cannot scale this technology to civil needs.
Very good question, and I think that we've already got examples of floating nuclear reactors which can be anchored somewhere conveniently. No, I think this is a historic chance, really. I don't think people really thought about producing smaller civil nuclear energy reactors. We've thought of that as an industry where you have giant bits of kit which take years to build and hopefully will last decades when they're in operation. But the concept of small modular reactors has been relatively recent, but it's really caught hold now, and there are serious competitors emerging. I think we're going to see a very healthy competition by the end of this decade, and I think that maybe it's something we should have woken up to 20 years ago, but we've been late, but it's now happening. So I'm quite optimistic about that.
Very well. I would ask the audience to think about questions that are of interest to you. In the meantime, Xiaoling Wu is asking, what is the potential of waste to energy process in Kazakhstan? Is it biogas, waste combustion? What do you think?
I think all. They have agricultural waste, they have municipal solid waste, so you need a lot of sources. So they have a potential in biogas, because most of the waste here, I think it's 60% at least organic. So they have a potential of the biogas. They have also the potential of gasification. The country have great resources.
Just to follow up on that, if you're taking an average sort of mid-high income country like Kazakhstan, and you start investing in your business and generating electricity or combined cycle from waste, what would the cost of your kilowatt compare to natural gas or coal?
The capex, it's more expensive. Waste to energy, if you cost 1 megawatt, at least between 3 to 4 million euro.
3 to 4 million per megawatt.
Per megawatt, yeah.
Okay.
It's expensive, but the people didn't think about we take the waste. It's a service. So the service itself, having the tipping fees on that. So
so the gas gas-fired combined cycle would be
Cheaper.
a million, twice.
The solar is cheaper. Solar 1 mega is cheaper.
Solar.
Yeah, the natural gas I don't know, but
Coal. There's a
coal
lot of coal in Kazakhstan.
it's cheaper.
But by
Coal
how
is
much?
cheaper.
By a factor of 2?
Coal is there is no comparison in a country like Kazakhstan with coal with any source of energy. Coal is cheap here,
Yeah.
and they have the resource. They have the natural resource.
That's why Kazakhstan is the Saudi Arabia of Bitcoin mining.
Yeah, yeah. That's why a lot of Chinese companies they are here for Bitcoin mining, but because of coal. But coal is not the green. You have CO2 emissions everywhere. So if you want to save the environment, you need to go to the expensive solution. That's what it is.
Follow up to you, Mr. Galal. In terms of bioenergy generation, does that mean we're just postponing the GHG emission?
No, it's not. It's not.
Explain what GHG is.
Yeah. Okay. It's not like postponing. It's another. It's another.
Greenhouse gas, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you compare the emissions of the coal and you compare the emissions of the alternative fuels, it's almost 30%. So less, 60% less than the coal. So it's completely different. But if you want to look the process of extract the coal and all of that, it's have more emissions. We need to think that we need to recycle our waste and get it on the system. The cheapest solution is the landfilling. So because of the spaces, if you look to, for example, we work in Europe. The cost of landfill in a country like UK, it's more than 200 pound. The cost
200 pounds for what?
for
a
1 ton, yeah.
Okay.
And the cost to landfill, and sometimes it costs 500 pound. The cost here it's less than $10.
Wow.
Yeah. So
So
because
is it making economic sense to just take garbage from UK, put it on by ship to Rotterdam, put it on a train, and just ship it east? Russia, Kazakhstan, you name it?
Thanks God, the government here doesn't approve that.
What about Russia?
No, the only country which is approved and they import the waste, China. China was importing the waste of Europe for almost 30 years.
But they're processing it, they're not landfilling it.
Yeah, and part of that, but you cannot control because the landfilling option there is very cheap. Thanks God, because currently the EU wake up, so they decide to do some incentives to the companies which is invest in recycling. So they want to stop at least sending the waste to China. And the China themselves stop because they have 1.3 billion people, they want to recycle themselves the waste. So it's another disaster. I don't think this is the solution. I think the solution is the circular economy. We need to get this waste into the system again.
Yeah.
Could we just drill down on sustainable aviation for a moment? Because I was interested in what was being said earlier on. I mean, in terms of transport, it looks as though surface transport is going to be cracked by batteries for small vehicles, maybe hydrogen for trucks and buses. But aviation is the most difficult part of the transport industry to successfully decarbonize. What's your realistic estimate of how long it's going to take to make that competitive?
I think it's going to take at least 15 years. I think we are at the beginning of this industry. We need to access to affordable resources, being some waste, wood waste. There's a large difference in wood waste now between Canada, Finland, France, for example, from a factor of 2. We need to have affordable electricity. Can it be nuclear? Can it be peak unused electricity that we can transform into hydrogen with electrolysis and make it e-fuels? All this remains under development. Many projects are under study, and I think the time this project will materialize and produce, we're talking about at least 2030, and run down the curve, maybe 10 years more. But I think it will happen, as I believe this is the only way realistically to, on a life cycle basis, decarbonize the industry. And coming back to Kazakhstan, one of the advantages of Kazakhstan we didn't mention is the large affordable land, be it for solar, wind, or bio crops. You have a large country, and when we come from Europe, we see the problem of land availability we have. If you want to install a farm, solar farm in France, you have a lot of permitting problems. If you want to install a wind farm, you have to go offshore, because onshore it's very difficult to get.
Onshore is more expensive by what, 30 to 50% at least?
Offshore?
Offshore than onshore wind.
I think offshore, depending if it's floating offshore, it would be, as you say, Ariel. If it's anchored, maybe a little bit less than this, but still in our country we cannot have onshore anymore. I mean, people, if you ask for a permit, you will wait for 10 years. So
actually, in Kazakhstan, you can do anchored offshore in the Caspian with very strong winds. I don't know, are they constant or not, but the winds in the Caspian area are very strong. Let's go to another question.
Just to finish, this is an opportunity to produce cheap hydrogen and add it to fuels and build a real industry. And this country has an experience of successful projects in the field. There have been so many, as I shown a little bit on my card. So thank you for your question, Tim. I think it's a big opportunity, and it will happen. It will take time, but if we don't start now, we never reach the challenges that we have.
I would caution that just enforcing very expensive renewable jet fuel or alternative jet fuel in the aviation in Europe and getting your ticket price double, that will cause a lot of resentment.
Fuel is about 30%, I think, of the airline cost today. By the way, it's not taxed by a regulation which is coming from 45, while in Europe all the other fuels, road fuels, are taxed by a factor of 3. So maybe someday some people are going to say we also have to tax, at least now for internal Europe, they're saying they will tax the jet fuel because they say it's not fair competition with road. And so anyhow, yes, it will cost more. I mean, it will, if you double the price of the fuel, or hopefully at the end of the day after the learning curve is done, you will increase by 15% your price, the ticket price. Is it detrimental? I think personally, I believe in the low carbon economy, many things will increase. So we'll have to live with that.
France has a tradition of dirigiste economy, so I'm not surprised.
No, I'm not a dirigist. I think the market, in the market, you will see that we talk about. I think Mahmoud can comment. If you talk about recycled plastics, recycled plastic is traded without any state input in this 2 to 3 times the price of fossil fresh plastics. This is just the market forces. This is not. I'm not a dirigist, Ariel, at all.
Okay. We have a question from Marjan Kulmamirova. What are the best examples in technological solutions speakers could recommend for the gas industry in its first steps towards energy transition? I don't know if we have an expert here on the panel. But because we're here, there must be somebody who can comment on that. Mr. Lincoln. Oh, all right.
I was hoping you were our gas expert.
Okay. Well, the only thing I know is that a lot of gas in Kazakhstan is recycled into the oil industry, re-injected, and not exported as much as, let's say, Turkmenistan or Azerbaijan. So if you have more discoveries, Kashagan has some synfuel or gas liquids, but if you have more gas, there's a huge market in Europe. The question is, can you pump it into Russia and via Russian Gazprom network, I don't know, via Ukraine, or liquefy it? Maybe you can get it. There's no gas pipeline into Azerbaijan. If you got it into the Azerbaijan system, you could get it to the Black Sea coast. The Georgians are talking about building LNG train there for Azeri gas. You may jump on that game, and then you can export LNG, especially as Turkey now is considering an additional canal to parallel Bosphorus, so there may be LNG traffic in and out of the Black Sea, which now, because of the Bosphorus, the Turks forbid. Let's move on. Gleb Nesterenko is asking, thanking us all. Thank you, Gleb. Nuxlear, if I pronounce it correctly. Nuxlear? Do you know anything about it? Nuxlear plants, probably is a type of nuclear. Nuclear plants can change its power quickly. So increase of % of nuclear plants as well as renewables leads to deficit of rapid reserve and flexibility. In your opinion, what is the best way to solve the problem? Maybe storage systems. In this case, what type of storage? First of all, I don't really agree that nuclear cannot get the base load up and down. So renewables, again, renewables have intermittency. We talked about it. Do you want to say anything about getting the base load up and down in nuclear?
Yes, I mean, I think the nuclear industry understands the importance of being able to do that, and it's getting much better at it. The capacity of a modern nuclear plant to be a load follower is quite different from what it would have been 30 years ago. So I think the nuclear is on the case, but as you also rightly say, getting cheaper electricity storage is also critically important. Flexible, potentially long-term storage is one of the technology breakthroughs which the world most needs.
A lot of questions about nuclear, ITR, thermonuclear energy. Okay, let's just go in the order received. Having an intensive construction boom in Kazakhstan, are there any proposals for management of construction waste?
Yeah, it can be done. There is a lot of, if you have a construction waste, you can recycle it. You can, for example, recycle the slag waste, which came from the steel manufacturers. You can recycle it into new construction material, can be used in the roads. You can construction the construction waste and get it to, so you can convert it to alternative raw material, which can be used on concrete, building roads, new bricks. There is a lot of applications. You can use it on construction industry.
Follow up on nuclear. What about production of hydrogen from nuclear, meaning using nuclear energy, presumably? Mr. Yao, do you want to comment on that? I mean, hydrogen is a huge topic. I spent a whole day with Mr. Moniz, the former Secretary of Energy of the United States, looking at hydrogen, and experts in the room who were, at the beginning of shale gas revolution in the States told me, we are with the nuclear where shale was in 2006, the very beginning of development of a whole industry, which will be a multi-billion-dollar industry, but specifically on nuclear and production of hydrogen. What can you say?
I think the prospects for using nuclear to produce clean hydrogen are very good. I think it's a potentially very large market for nuclear, and certainly one that the nuclear energy industry is quite excited about.
And another nuclear question from Shingiz Sadiq, who already asked a question. When we talk about nuclear, we mostly talk about and elaborate how clean it is, how sustainable it is, and so far, so forth. But what about radioactive waste? What would we do about it? Is there any other way other than dumping it in the earth? Hint, hint, fast breeder reactors. But please go ahead.
Well, the first thing to say, of course, is that the legacy problem is the main part of the problem. The early nuclear reactors produced huge amounts of waste.
Right.
A modern nuclear reactor produces a tiny fraction of how much waste was originally produced. So we're dealing largely with a legacy problem. I think it's been dealt with pretty safely. It's very highly regulated. It always puzzles me. No one worries about the waste from coal, which is killing people through destroying air quality. And no one actually worries about the number of lives that are lost in mining the coal either. So coal has a sort of magical status, which doesn't have to meet the standards which other more recent energy technologies do have to meet. It's quite right that the modern ones should meet tighter standards, but it's a pity we didn't cotton on to the fact that coal has been breaching these things almost, well, from the year dot. But on nuclear waste, there is obviously a very, very long life of a small amount of waste, and there's no other solution than burying it in some very safe place underground. I think that internationally, the best place would be put it in the middle of Australia, where there's masses of space, and the geology, I believe, is quite robust there. But that would require international agreement about how to get it there, and that by itself is a pretty thorny question.
So you're not a big fast breeder reactor supporter?
Yes, no, that's also part of the solution to this. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So you put it in a fast breeder reactor, you bombard it, you get more fuel, but in the end you get a certain amount of plutonium, which is the only use we have for plutonium these days is nuclear bombs, which we don't want to do. Back to waste. A question from Ali Khan Aitbai. Monsieur Saint-Enac and Mr. Galal, nowadays Kazakhstan is struggling by inadequate or waste recycling and recycled product use. We have only several government and non-government organizations that are conducting small amounts of waste recycling. That's really the crux of the matter. What one decision right now should the government and large-scale organizations do to solve this issue? Mr. Saint-Enac, why don't you start, please?
It's a complex question. I think the first question when you talk about waste is about collecting. Before talking about processing, you need to collect waste and sort them. You have organic waste on one side, which you can eventually generate biogas with or gasify. You have plastic waste that you can reprocess to make new virgin plastics. So I think if we talk about government, the first thing would be to organize a good collection and separation of waste. That would be my first answer before talking about processing them.
Do you have any insights? Which countries had the most success in changing the attitudes? Because a lot of it is, having little kids growing up with separating the garbage. I kind of like to separate my garbage. I have paper separately, plastic separately, and other garbage separately. We have 3 in Maryland. But do you use kindergarten? Do you use childcare? Do you use elementary school? Do you use television commercials, social media? How do you convince people to do it? Are there any financial incentives? And of course, Mr. Galal, you're in this business, please jump in.
I'll start and hand over. I was in Paris last week following the plastics treaty negotiations. So also about waste, not about energy, but not unrelated either. And the interesting thing about plastics is it is thought of as waste. And so one of the discussions in the corridor was, effectively, across so many different areas, one has to do away with the word waste. The word waste implies a linear way of thinking. It's not that one doesn't end up with some portion of residue that one has to manage at the end, but it is the whole idea that comes out at the end as waste needs to be rethought. And so the value, for example, of plastic after its single use, it needs to be understood as a valuable commodity. What you do with it, how you reuse it, which was a lot of the discussion, how you transform it, how you recycle it, all of these are important potential options with what you do with a substance you've just used. And I think in a way, I was listening to the conversation up till now, thinking how these issues are coming up across these different areas. We're talking about, I don't know if you know, but 55% of emissions are from energy, but 45% are from materials, from stuff. It's the world of stuff. It's everything we're sitting on, sitting in, lying on, driving around, and so on. So the relationship between energy and manufacturing and the world of materials is a very close one. And we're finding that some of these categories of thinking that we're trying to apply in the area of energy apply in the area of materials and vice versa. Anyway, that would be the general comment that I would make on that. To answer your question specifically, I don't think we're very far along at all, really anywhere, with respect to that fundamental change, societal change. I can name certain countries where I've been where they seem to do a slightly better job at recycling plastic bottles. But that's a very, very, very small thing in the aggregate.
We are close to the end of this very engaging and interesting panel. I will ask 3 questions. You can pick and choose whatever you want to answer. And we have to finish in 2 minutes, on time. So I'll go from the last question back to whatever is left. The last question is a really nice, geeky question. How would you evaluate the effectiveness of government changes to their regulatory environments with the aim of creating growth of newer, low-carbon solutions such as CCUS/hydrogen/biofuels over the recent years? And we don't have 3 hours to talk about it. Going once, going twice. Anybody? Ms. Lincoln.
I wish there were more to evaluate, I think is my first answer. I think it's early days. It's very, very early days. Things are changing very fast. Some of the best data you can find out there are the reports put out by the International Energy Agency that is doing now annual reports on a range of topics. But the data is changing so fast. Electrical cars are one example. For 2022, it reached 15% of total car produced were electrical cars. This is a massive 2-year change. But they predicted that in 2023 they were going to grow 35% relative to 2022. The space is changing very quickly in all of these areas.
Very good. Second question. Kazakhstan is to implement mega hydrogen project at the Caspian Basin with Svewind AG company. What effects to the environment and the sea level of the Caspian would it have? May it lead to Aral Sea type environmental catastrophe? Question mark. I say no, because the volume is not going to be that big. But on the other hand, I didn't see the figures. I didn't crack the numbers. I'll leave it at that. What about you gentlemen? Anybody wants to talk about hydrogen in the Caspian? The gigantic Svewind AG? No? Okay, last question. Any thoughts about ITER, International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, fusion? We didn't talk about fusion. We don't have 3 hours to talk about fusion. Fusion, yes, no, maybe.
It would be great if we had it. It would be great if we had it, if we cracked the fusion technology. As long as I've been interested in nuclear, it's always been about 30 years away. I think the ITER exercise is a very genuine one. I think a lot of resources being thrown at it, and it's worth doing, but it's not going to make the impact. We need to make a big impact in the first half of this century, and it ain't going to come from fusion.
Well, and with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank our panelists for a terrific panel. And thank you all very much. Thank you all very much for being a terrific audience. And come again. And by the way, just to plug, tomorrow, 1:45, I'm speaking on a COP28. I'll be speaking rare earth minerals. Please come.
Global leaders and experts at the Congress Center on June 8th and 9th for discussions